The Great War. World War I was called the Great War because so many countries were involved. When the war started in 1914, Germany and Austria-Hungary made up an alliance called the Central Powers. We remember at the time, Italy was actually a part of this alliance as well. Great Britain, France, and Russia made up the Allied Powers. Remember before the war, this was called the Triple Entente. Countries joined on each side as the war went on and on. Germany and Austria were located in the center of Europe, between France and Russia. For this reason, the war was fought on two fronts, or two different battlefields. The Eastern Front was along the Russian-German border, and the Western Front was in France, near the German border. Early in the war, on the Western Front, Allied troops stopped the Germans from invading Paris, France. But they ended up in a standoff with German troops. Neither side would back down. The two armies dug miles of trenches that were deep enough for soldiers to stand in. The trenches were protected by barbed wire and concrete machine gun nests. Strips of land, known as no man's land, separated Allied trenches from the trenches of the Central Powers. In the trenches, soldiers ate, tried to sleep, and waited for the next attack. When a commander gave the order to attack, a group of soldiers would climb out of their trench. Then, they worked their way across no man's land toward the enemy trenches. The attacks did not work well because the men had to move across open fields, that no man's land. Soldiers could easily be shot by the enemy's machine guns. The other side would then launch a counterattack with the same results. Often, thousands of soldiers died in order to win a few hundred yards of territory. Modern weapons added to the horror of the war. Rapid-fire machine guns made it nearly impossible for soldiers to advance across no man's land. Poisonous gas was used as a weapon by both sides. It caused soldiers to choke or suffer burns and blisters. New military vehicles were used in World War I. Armored tanks could move across barbed wire. U-boats, or submarines, were used to sink enemy supply ships. Large, gas-filled blimps called Zeppelins dropped bombs from the sky. Airplanes armed with machine guns fought each other. World War I turned into a war of attrition. This means that the war was based on wearing the other side down. By constantly attacking and killing soldiers, each side caused its enemy to suffer heavy losses. This type of warfare had a huge price. When the Allies won the war in 1918, over 9 million soldiers had died in battle. Millions more were wounded. Let's take a look at the questions here. So in the first section of questions, we see the first section of questions here. Our first question is, World War I was fought on blank. And we remember that it was fought on both sides of Germany on what was called the Eastern Front and the Western Front. So it was fought on B, two fronts. Trenches were protected by, well, we remember the no man's land between the trenches, but we remember that the trenches themselves were protected by barbed wire and machine guns. So even if you could reach the enemy trench, you would, when you got there, you would have to climb through barbed wire to get inside. And while you're tangled in barbed wire, there'd be machine guns trying to shoot you. The strips of land between the trenches were called no man's land. This is because it was obvious that no one could control that amount of land. It belonged to no man. And it was no place for a man to stand. While soldiers on the attack worked their way toward the enemy's trench, the enemy would all of the above. They would use barbed wire to slow them down. They would fire at them with machine guns, and they would use poison gas against them. World War I and trench warfare was hell on earth. Number 5, World War I was a blank. It was a C. It was a war of attrition where both sides tried to wear the other down. It was war the way that children think of war, where the whole point is to kill the enemy. That was the basic strategy of World War I, was to kill the bad guys. And in this pursuit, many millions of people died. Young men dreaming of glory, they died alone in the mud. In a war of blank, each side tried to wear the other side down. This is a war of attrition. When World War I ended, over 9 million soldiers had died in battle. And the space of land between enemy trenches was called no man's land. It was the little bit of territory that an army would hope to gain by crossing it, and it would come at tremendous cost. Allied troops on the blank were in a standoff with German troops. This is the Western Front. So as French soldiers faced off against German soldiers, they could basically look up above the trench and see that the enemy was there. And then when they tried to cross, they were stopped. And when the Germans tried to cross, they were stopped. And at some battles, such as the Battle of the Somme, excuse me, let me shut my door. In some battles, like the Battle of the Somme, we saw more people killed than, I believe, any other battle in human history. The Battle of the Somme was the single bloodiest day of battle that people have ever fought. I guess it was more than one day, but it was very, very, very deadly. And the amount of land that was gained by the winner was a trivial amount of land. It was pointless. So lots of people died for nothing. During battles in World War I, Zeppelins, these are huge gas-filled airships, sort of like a blimp. They would drop bombs from the sky. Later on, airplanes would be fitted with bombs and would drop bombs from the sky. But earlier in the war, they would use Zeppelins to carry bombs into the sky. The airplanes, however, would do a lot of spotting and reconnaissance. They would look at where enemy troops are and try to get an idea of what was going on. And then pretty soon they fitted these with machine guns to shoot each other out of the sky. So if you had an enemy airplane up there trying to drop bombs or trying to scout where your troops are, you would send another airplane up with a machine gun to try to shoot them out of the sky. World War I lasted from about the time of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in 1914. It lasted until 1918. In response to the stalemate, in response to the barbed wire and the trenches, armies developed armored trucks that we call tanks. Okay, a tank was initially named after a great big water tank, a steel water tank, which is kind of the idea. We would send a great big water tank full of troops across the barbed wire. You know, you put wheels on a water tank, and that's where they got their names. But essentially, it's just a truck with armor. Soldiers during World War I, they lived in the trenches. The conditions of living in a trench were terrible. It was almost always wet. They would almost never be under a roof. When it was cold outside, they were out in the cold. It was miserable. And when ships were sent to resupply them, U-boats would sink them. U-boats would sink supply ships. A U-boat, again, is just another name for a submarine. It's a boat that can travel underwater, hidden. During the war, as Americans, as heirs to sort of European culture, we tend to think of the Western Front, where France and Germany battled, where Britain entered the war against Germany on the Western side. But the greatest number of casualties actually took place on the Eastern Front. And the country that suffered the most casualties there was Russia. Part of the reason that Russia suffered so many casualties was, just as Germany had suspected, Russia wasn't really prepared to fight the war. They sent troops into battle undertrained and underarmed, and many of them died. I'll have to look here. It was 1.7 million died, and almost 5 million were wounded. So World War I came at an enormous cost, and Russia bore a huge amount of that cost. Italy, was it a member of the Allies or the Central Powers? Well, when we look at this chart, we can see Italy was a member of the Allies. And Italy certainly was a member of the Allies, but just prior to the war, and this is confusing to us, Italy was on the other team. Okay. Before the war, Italy was part of Germany's team, a part of the Triple Alliance. Once the war began, Italy had some differences with Austria, and essentially Italy changed teams early in the war. Question 3 asks, why do you think the United States had fewer casualties than many other countries in World War I? Well, one very important reason for this is that the United States didn't enter the war until much later in the war, and they made a decisive difference in the war. It might be true that if the United States had not entered World War I, that the Triple Alliance, or I should say the Central Powers, Germany and Austria, might have won the war, because after suffering such heavy losses, you can see the losses here, Russia actually left the war. The war came at way too great a cost for Russians, and the Russians left the war. And as soon as they left, Germany had the upper hand in the war. Okay, but just as soon as Russia left, the United States entered the war. Because it entered so late, though, it suffered fewer casualties than most of the other countries in the war. We can see that the United States, it cost us about less than 500,000 men, which is still a huge amount of men, but not nearly as much as Russia, right? Which is 5 times as much at least. So, and that's why the United States suffered so few losses in comparison. World War I was a war of attrition. It was a difficult war, and the hopes of glory and the hopes of vengeance and of adventure that many Europeans set off with at the beginning of the war, they ended in terrible tragedy for most of them, for some 9 million. Okay, so that is our review of the Great War. That actually concludes our Great War unit.